So it's 1:23 in the morning on April 26, 1986, and you are standing inside the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, deep in the heart of Soviet Ukraine. The air smells of ozone and hot metal. The instruments inside the control room of reactor number 4 are starting to behave strangely, needles swinging wildly, alarms sounding for fractions of a second before being silenced by nervous hands. The operators around you are exchanging quick glances, the kind of look that mixes confusion with a fear nobody can yet name. Something is wrong, deeply wrong, but no one in the world yet understands the scale of what is about to happen. In a matter of seconds, the greatest nuclear accident in human history will tear through the night, and the lives of millions of people, including yours, will never be the same again. You are about to witness the modern apocalypse. If you want to know the full truth behind Chernobyl, subscribe to the channel and hit the like button right now. It really helps bring more stories like this one straight to you. Step back a few hours in time and you will begin to understand how humanity arrived at that particular night. The V.I. Lenin nuclear power station, known worldwide as Chernobyl, sat approximately 130 kilometers north of Kiev in the Soviet Republic of Ukraine. It was considered one of the most modern and safest facilities in the entire Soviet bloc, and a powerful symbol of the technological strength of a nation competing directly with the West in the nuclear arena. On the afternoon of April 25th, 1986, the night shift operations team received what seemed like a routine assignment: conduct a safety test on reactor number 4. The goal was to verify whether the reactor's turbines could generate enough electrical power to keep the cooling systems running during the first seconds after a potential power outage, that critical window before emergency generators could activate. It was a test that had already been attempted before, without success, and this time it needed to be completed. You are there watching the afternoon shift prepare to begin the procedure, when suddenly a phone call from Kiev interrupts everything. The city's electrical grid operator needs the reactor to keep running for a few more hours to support the afternoon energy demand. The test is postponed. The afternoon crew waits and waits until eventually they are replaced by the night shift. People who had no involvement in the detailed planning of the experiment and who were being introduced to the procedure quickly. While the sequence of events had already begun, Anatoly Dyatlov, the deputy chief engineer supervising the test that night, was well known for his authoritarian and inflexible personality. Whenever younger operators expressed concerns, he pushed them aside with a mix of irritation and arrogance. Inside the closed and rigid hierarchy of the Soviet Union, questioning a superior was not simply inconvenient, it was a deep cultural violation and almost unthinkable inside the walls of a state facility. Plant used a type of reactor called the RBMK, an exclusively Soviet technology that contained a serious design flaw known by very few people. Under certain low-power conditions, the reactor became unstable and extremely difficult to control. Instead of slowing the nuclear reaction, it could accelerate it. This information had been classified and hidden from public knowledge, so that no doubt could ever fall upon Soviet technological pride. And it is in this environment of exhaustion, urgency, rigid hierarchy, and a hidden design flaw that reactor number 4 begins to be prepared for the test. The mechanism of disaster is already moving quietly, like a clock counting down before the alarm finally rings. By the time the test finally begins, it is already past midnight. The team needs to reduce the reactor's power to a specific level between 700 and 1,000 thermal megawatts, so the experiment can be conducted safely, but something goes wrong almost immediately. The operator responsible for power regulation becomes distracted for a moment, perhaps overwhelmed by the long hours of exhaustion after waiting for the signal from Kiev, and the reactor's power suddenly plummets in a terrifying drop. Falling close to zero, the reactor enters a state known as xenon poisoning, where a buildup of a radioactive byproduct inside the core begins to suppress the nuclear reaction, making it extremely difficult to recover any power output. The correct decision at that moment would have been to stop the test completely and wait for the xenon to dissipate naturally, a process that could take anywhere from 12 to 24 hours before restarting the procedure the following day. You feel the tension spreading through the room. The operators know what should be done, but Dyatlov refuses to wait. The test must be completed that night, and he orders the team to continue, manually withdrawing the control rods from the core in order to force the reactor back to power. The control rods are the mechanism designed to moderate the nuclear reaction, and removing too many of them is like lifting your foot off the brake while the engine continues to accelerate on its own. The power slowly climbs again, but stabilizes at an extremely low level around 200 megawatts, far below the minimum required by the test protocol. Even so, Dyatlov orders them to proceed. You watch the young operators hesitate for a brief moment, exchange uncertain glances, and then, like so many people confronted by unyielding authority, they obey. At 1:23 in the morning, the water pumps are activated to simulate the test conditions, and the sudden flow of cold water into the core causes an additional drop in power output. To compensate, the last remaining manual controls are withdrawn. The reactor is now operating with a dangerously low number of control rods inserted far below the minimum safety thresholds established by the Soviet manuals themselves. At this moment, the reactor is balanced on a razor's edge. Any additional disturbance could trigger a chain reaction that the emergency systems will not be able to contain in time, and no one in the room seems to realize that the abyss is already directly beneath their feet. If you're enjoying this story, subscribe to the channel. There's a lot more content like this on the way. It is 1:23 and 40 seconds, and one of the operators suddenly notices that the power readings are rising in an abnormal way. He immediately presses the emergency button, AZE5, which should insert all the control rods into the core at the same time and shut down the nuclear reaction. It is the emergency brake and the last possible resort. But here lies the cruel irony that will determine the fate of Chernobyl. The control rods inside the RBMK reactor contained a catastrophic design flaw, and seconds of rod insertion did not slow the reaction down but instead accelerated it. The tips of the rods were made of graphite, a material that briefly intensifies the nuclear reaction before moderating it. And in a fraction of a second, the reactor's power does not decrease. It explodes. You feel the ground tremble beneath your feet before you hear anything at all. It is a deep, visceral vibration. The kind of movement your body instantly understands is wrong. Then the sound arrives, not a sharp explosion like those heard in war films, and not a quick crack, but a massive low roar, as if the earth itself had swallowed something it could not digest. Two explosions erupt in rapid succession. The first is a steam explosion caused by the sudden and violent superheating of the cooling water. The second may have been chemical or even partially nuclear, a question scientists still debate today. Together, these explosions, reactor, launching fragments of the radioactive core into the open air, and ripping a hole through the containment building roof as if it were made of paper. The core of reactor number 4 is now completely exposed to the atmosphere with no containment and no control, burning at temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun. Above it, in the complete absence of any protection, a strange blue glow begins to appear. The eerie Cherenkov radiation, a ghostly light, faster than the speed of light in water. The firefighters who will arrive within minutes will find that light strangely beautiful, and they will not realize they are looking directly at death. In the first hours after the explosion, the world still does not know what has happened. The Soviet Union does not know, or perhaps chooses to pretend it does not know. The residents of Pripyat, the satellite city built to house the plant workers, are sleeping less than 3 kilometers from the burning reactor, completely unaware of what is already being released into the air. They breathe. The first firefighters arrive without proper protective equipment and without dosimeters capable of measuring the real levels of radiation. The few devices they had were broken or exceeded the maximum reading on their scale. They treat the disaster as if it were an ordinary fire, stepping over pieces of graphite and fragments of nuclear fuel scattered across the ground. They feel a strange metallic taste in their mouths, a burning sensation in their eyes, and waves of dizziness they assume come from the heat. Many of them will be dead within weeks. Inside the plant, the surviving operators try desperately to activate cooling systems that no longer exist, sending colleagues to inspect sections of the reactor that have already been destroyed. There is a collective refusal to accept the reality of what has happened. Disbelief, Soviet discipline, and basic psychological survival combine into one dangerous illusion. The core could not have exploded because the manuals said it was impossible. Dyatlov, still inside the control room, continues to insist that the reactor remains intact. Yet while he repeats this claim, the fire above the reactor is throwing a massive plume of radioactive material into the upper atmosphere. That cloud will soon begin spreading across Europe, drifting over Belarus, Poland, Sweden, Germany, and France. Families enjoying picnics, Children playing outside and farmers working in open fields are all unknowingly being exposed to the invisible ghost of Chernobyl. Back in Pripyat, the morning of April 26th arrives calm and beautiful. The sun is shining, flowers are beginning to bloom in the early Soviet spring, and the families of the workers step outside curious about the distant smoke and the helicopters beginning to circle above the reactor. Local authorities are instructed not to create panic, and the city will not be evacuated until 36 hours after the explosion. More than enough time for the radiation absorbed by every resident to begin its silent, irreversible damage. In the years that follow, more than 600,000 people will be mobilized in the enormous effort to contain the disaster. They will become known as the liquidators, including miners, soldiers, scientists, and civilians drafted or volunteering to work above the burning reactor in shifts measured in seconds and minutes. Their mission is to construct a massive concrete sarcophagus over the exposed core. Many of them will receive radiation doses that are never officially acknowledged. Many will become ill, many will die, and most of them will never fully understand the danger they faced. The weeks that followed the explosion became a race against something invisible. For a few days, the Soviet Union attempted to minimize the accident internally, but the situation quickly escaped their control when radiation monitors at a nuclear plant in Sweden suddenly began to trigger alarms, and technicians discovered that the contamination was not coming from inside the country, but drifting from somewhere far to the east. At that moment, the secret could no longer be hidden, and on May 14th, 18 days after the explosion, Mikhail Gorbachev finally publicly acknowledged the disaster, while the world watched what appeared to be the first visible crack in the armor of Soviet invulnerability. Pripyat was evacuated in a rush, with residents ordered to leave everything behind, including documents, photographs, pets, and even the dinner that still sat warm on their tables. They were told they would return in 3 days, but nobody ever came back to live there again. The city remains today, slowly being reclaimed by nature as plants, trees, and wildlife move into the empty buildings, turning Pripyat into an open-air museum of the moment when time abruptly stopped. A 30-kilometer exclusion zone around the plant was established and remains largely off-limits even today, although controlled tourism is now permitted. Inside this zone, wildlife has unexpectedly flourished in the absence of human activity, and animals such as wolves, bears, lynxes, and wild horses roam freely through forests that have grown over abandoned farmland, creating what has become one of the largest unintended wildlife reserves in Europe, born directly from catastrophe. The true human cost of the disaster is extremely difficult to calculate with precision, because the Soviet Union was always careful with the truth. Official records from the time acknowledged only 31 direct deaths, yet independent research health organizations and decades of scientific study suggest that tens of thousands of people may have died from radiation-related illnesses, including cancers that developed slowly over years, children born with severe deformities in contaminated regions, and countless lives shortened by exposure that governments would never fully admit. The consequences of Chernobyl extended far beyond the immediate physical damage or the medical impact. Many historians argue with strong evidence that the disaster played a decisive role in the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union itself. Years later, Gorbachev would write that Chernobyl may have been the single most important factor behind the political openness known as glasnost, because the catastrophe revealed in a brutal and undeniable way that a system built on secrecy, censorship, and institutional lies could not control a physical reality that ignored propaganda borders and political authority. The concrete sarcophagus, hurriedly constructed in 1986 by the liquidators, was eventually covered decades later by a massive steel structure known as the new safe. Confinement completed in 2016, this enormous arch was slowly moved into place over the destroyed reactor to contain the radiation for the next century. Yet beneath that structure, the core of reactor number 4 continues to emit heat and radiation and remains deadly for generations that have not yet been born. You leave behind that April night, the control room filled with silenced alarms and exhausted operators, the city that woke to a quiet spring morning and never returned home again, and you carry with you the lesson that Chernobyl continues to teach the world, that the greatest disasters in history are rarely caused by enemies from outside, but by arrogance, silence, and the dangerous belief that the impossible could never happen here. But it can, and in April of 1986 it did. If this story moved you, hit the like button right now. It makes a huge difference for the channel, and subscribe so you never miss the next video. Drop a comment below telling me what you thought about Chernobyl. I really want to hear from you.